meaning, right? And so in other words, meaning equals fact, historical fact, okay? But of course, if you read a poem, Adrian's a wonderful poet, right? Is the meaning of your poetry factual? Yeah, but it's told in symbols and images. It's an artistic expression. It's a literary expression, right? And let me give you a simple example of this. If we read a text that says, my love is a red rose, okay? How do I know what that means? What was the intention of the author? What does that mean, my love is a red rose, right? If I read that in the context of a book that, let's say, a guy writes about how to grow roses, then I take that literally, right? Well, this guy's saying that he really loves roses, right? But if I read this in a book of poetry, does it mean that, well, the poet loves roses? No. It's metaphorical, right? Its meaning is not factual, its meaning is metaphorical, see? And what's the difference of that? Well, you can't get at the meaning of a text unless you look at the context in which it is written, right? The context in which it is written. So you can know all of these stories about the birth of Jesus and know nothing about how people interpreted these stories when they first heard it. You know nothing about the context in which these utterances and these stories were first presented. And that's a very unusual thing, because in what other literary endeavor does that occur? Can you think of one? For example, let's say that you read William Shakespeare, Hamlet, okay? And you say, man, you know, I love this story about Hamlet, right? And isn't one of the first things that you would do is that you would start to explore, well, who was William Shakespeare? Yes or no, right? Isn't that a natural, I mean, just naturally we would do that, right? Well, who was William Shakespeare? What century did William Shakespeare live? Who was this guy? What was his life about, right? Now imagine in your exploration as to the meaning of this text, you find out, well, there was never really a prince of Denmark that was named Hamlet, okay? And then you say to yourself, well, this is a bunch of baloney. This is not literally true, right? Right? We never do that. We never do that with any other literary work of art except the scriptural text. Now, my question to you is, why is that the case? Why is that the case? How did that come about, right? Who told us and why did they tell us that these stories not only teach us the stories, but say, and these stories mean this, right? And in order to be a religious person means that you have to literally interpret these stories as fact, that the meaning of these stories is fact, right? I've thought about this for years, and the more I think about it, the stranger and more unusual that becomes, right? Because even if you take these stories in Scripture as literal facts, right? That in and of itself is an interpretation of the text. Is it clear what I'm saying, right? If you say, well, the truth of the Bible is that all of these stories literally happened. Once upon a time, Jesus was born of a virgin. There was an Adam and Eve. There was a Garden of Eden, and all of this stuff are literal facts, right? That is an interpretation of the text. That is an interpretation of the text. Now, over the course of years, in the last couple hundred years, there was textual criticism was developed. It's called the historical critical method, right? And it's getting at precisely those questions. Who wrote the Bible? When was it written? How did the people that first heard it understand it, right? And you look at the text itself, the Gospels that we're going to look at, Matthew and Luke, as literary text, and you examine them as literary text, yeah? Now, this was called the historical critical method, and this developed in the last 150 years, right? And we're going to use that historical critical method. We aren't going to speak about it specifically necessarily, but we're going to use that methodology to derive the meaning of these texts, all right? So we're going to assume that, and this is, you know, a great assumption of this book, The First Christmas, is that these are literary texts, and the meaning of the text is very much like, or you derive the meaning of the text by doing a literary analysis and treating it as if it is a work of literature, as if it is a work of art. Are you with me? All right. And so let me begin by sharing with you some ideas coming out of a wonderful book. This guy, John Shelby Spong, was he was a contemporary of both Borg and Crossan, right? And he was an interesting guy because he was a bishop of Newark. He was an Episcopal priest, right? And he was a radical biblical scholar and a great, brilliant biblical scholar. And he maintained his affiliation with the Episcopal Church his entire life. Now, that's no small feat, right? That's no small feat. So that makes him an interesting guy. And also the fact of his work makes him an interesting guy, what he thought, right? This book, John Shelby Spong, is called Biblical Literalism, a Gentile Heresy, right? And it's a really wonderful book, a very interesting book, because he lays out a theory at looking at these biblical texts in a literary way, right? And let me share with you some ideas coming out of this text as sort of a prelude to our study here. Has anybody ever heard of that guy before? John Shelby Spong? Yeah. Oh, yeah? Good. This is the way he starts. He says, to read the Gospels properly, I now believe requires a knowledge of Jewish culture, Jewish symbols, Jewish icons, and the tradition of Jewish storytelling, right? You cannot understand the Gospels without understanding their Jewish context, okay? He says it requires an understanding of what the Jews called midrash, or what we would call exegesis, right? Exegesis, and we'll speak a little more about what that means later, but interpretation, okay? Texts don't interpret themselves. He says, I regard biblical literalism as a Gentile heresy. I feel a burning necessity to expose fundamentalism for what I believe it is. Unless biblical literalism is challenged overtly in the Christian church itself, it will, in my opinion, kill the Christian faith. It is not just a benign nuisance that afflicts Christianity on its edges. It is a mentality that renders the Christian faith unbelievable to an increasing number of citizens of our world. And boy, isn't that the truth. If you want to, when I think, I mean, you know, the church is no picnic. It's never been a picnic. And it's as flawed and crazy as all social institutions are, right? It's evil and corrupt as politics. The church is as evil exactly in the same way and as corrupt as any other social institution, right? But a lot of the reason why people are don't find religion meaningful anymore, and especially about Christianity, right, is because for the last 50 years, the only sort of Christianity that people have been exposed to has been biblical fundamentalism. I remember as a child watching Billy Graham. Do you remember this? When you were a kid, my mother loved Billy Graham. And so when Billy Graham, like once a year or twice a year, would come on television, we would always watch this, right? And he was a very powerful speaker, spoke with a Southern accent and all of this and that. He was a biblical fundamentalist, right? And everybody, all of these television evangelists for the last 50 years have been biblical fundamentalists, right? So when people in our culture think of religion, what do they think of? People who literally believe in the truth of their mythopoetic stories. People who literally believe in their religious metaphors, right? Now imagine this, okay? You're living in a world, as I was like the way that Joseph Campbell put it. He said, we have yet to have a religion that was thought out in a heliocentric universe, okay? These texts that come to us, let's just talk about the Christian texts. These Christian texts that come to us, right? Here, over 2,000 years ago, right? They were written in an entirely different cosmology than we have, all right? And this is what the question that Campbell was raising, right? Well, how can you expect people to take a religion seriously when it was thought out in a completely different cosmology at a completely different time, right? And he says, and we have yet to have a religion that's thought out in a heliocentric universe, right? So in other words, taking modern science and the findings of modern science seriously, right? And this is what we are doing here. This is what we're doing right now, right? Seeing the text, seeing the Bible as literature and examining the Bible as to the context of its meaning, its original meaning, its intent, seeing it as a piece of literature, as a piece of art, right? That is doing religion in a different modality. Are you with me? So we are not thinking about these texts the way that Lutherans thought about these texts in the 16th century. Or are we appropriating these texts the way that they were thought about a couple hundred years ago? Or in the way that they were thought about when I was growing up, right? So just the examination of these texts, just the reading of these kinds of books, just having this discussion, right, is creating a new religious consciousness. Are you with me? Right? And this is the way that religious consciousness emerges, right? And so is it clear what I said, what I'm driving at here, right? Let me share with you some more thoughts here coming out of Spong. He said, most people have never read the New Testament chronologically. And when they do, they see at once that Christianity is clearly evolving within these texts. Okay? So the texts themselves is the evolution of what people thought about the Christ event. Okay? Paul, who wrote between the years 51 and 64, right? So the first writings that we have in the New Testament comes from Paul, right? And he wrote, we think, somewhere between 51 and 64. Miracles, John the Baptist, Judas Iscariot, the Transfiguration, and the narrative of the Passion enter the tradition in the 8th decade with Mark. Okay, so if you look at the writings of St. Paul, you don't have anything about the life of Jesus. You don't have any of these stories, right? Those stories didn't emerge until Mark wrote, okay? Now imagine this. The virgin birth, the Sermon on the Mount, and narratives giving details about Jesus' resurrection first entered the story with Matthew in the 9th decade. The most familiar parables, the resurrection as resuscitation, the story of the ascension, the Pentecost experience, receiving the Holy Spirit, are gifts to the Christian narrative received from Luke. And they enter the tradition in the late 9th or early 10th century. Decade. The idea suggesting that Jesus was pre-existent, that he was of one substance with God, are introduced by John in the late 10th century. Okay? Now, this is very, decade, I mean, yeah, sorry, decade, right? Now, this is very important because you start to see that the idea behind what he's trying to drive at to get us to understand, right, is that these texts that come to us, Paul, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, they were all written in various times and in different places, okay? This is not one just connected narrative here that was written by eyewitness accounts, okay? But that actually there's an evolution of thought that's going on here, see? And of course, we see this in the Gospels themselves. I mean, compare the Gospel of John with the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And what do you find? A whole different understanding of the Christ event, right? Of the Christ event, yeah? And so why is that? If you don't understand those gospel texts as just one big, long, connected narrative, are you with me? Written by eyewitness accounts. In other words, if you don't appropriate them literally in this sense, right? And you open your eyes and you look at the context in which these texts were written, then you find these very interesting things, right? For example, this is called the documentary hypothesis, all right? This is lies at the heart of what they call the historical critical method when it's applied to the New Testament text, okay? The documentary hypothesis, and it goes like this, okay? What do we say? It was Paul's letter, right? And then Mark, okay? And then Matthew, and then Luke, okay? And then it's a strange Gospel of John, right? That doesn't seem to be relatable to the rest of these, okay? This is John, all right. Now, when did we say Paul was writing in like 50 to the 60s, okay? Mark was like 65 to 70. Okay, and then let's see, Luke was like 80. Matthew was like 75 to 80, something like this, right? And Luke was then 80 to 85. And then John, many people believe John was written in the next century, all right? Right? So maybe 90 to, let's say John was going to be like 90 to 110, all right? Okay? So this is a chronology, okay? Now, what else do we know? Well, Paul wrote these epistles, but Paul was traveling all throughout that Middle Eastern area, right? All the way to Rome, all throughout that Middle Eastern area, right? Mark, we think, was written, we don't know these things for sure, but we think that Mark was written in Rome, right? And Matthew was written, Matthew was probably like Antioch or Syria, right? Where was Luke written? Well, we think that Luke was written maybe also in Rome, but many scholars now think that it was maybe Alexandria, Egypt, okay? So imagine this. Egypt, this was in Rome, this is coming out of Israel, right? But, it's, Paul was a mixture, right, of that whole Mediterranean area, right? Turkey, Egypt, Turkey, Italy, right? So look at what's happening here, right? Mark, or let's start with Paul, okay? Paul was developing, Paul knew very little about the life of Jesus. He didn't know these stories. Why? Because these stories didn't exist yet. Okay? The stories didn't exist yet. Because all of this, remember, all of this written text is coming out of an oral tradition. Okay, out of an oral tradition. There were very few people that could read at the time of Jesus. When these texts were written, very few people could actually read these texts, right? Because they were peasants. Most of the people were peasants. My grandmother and grandfather spoke broken English and broken German, you know? They were people. I was raised with people that was very much like these agrarian people that heard these stories for the first time, right? So in the Gospel of Paul, which I speak about a lot, when does Jesus become divine? After Jesus' death. Because Paul was writing, when did Jesus die? Well, Jesus was born, we think, maybe at 4, okay, and maybe he lived for 33. So let's say before 4 and 40, okay? So the first, not the Gospels, but the first writings about Jesus that we have recorded in the New Testament comes from Paul 10 to 20 years after that event, after Jesus lived. And let's call this the Christ event, all right? The Christ event. So that's 20 years. Now, look, Mark was written 15 to 20 years beyond that. Okay? So if Jesus died at 40, this is 25, maybe 30 years later, Mark was written, right? Maybe 40 years later, and maybe over that, but at least that, right? Maybe more than 50, maybe more than 30, maybe more than 40, right? But the idea, these reflections are coming out of an oral tradition, okay? And they were written at different times, all right? The first gospel itself was written at least 30 years after the death of Jesus, okay? These were not written by eyewitnesses, okay? Now, Mark wrote, what was Mark's context, right? Well, he was writing 30 years after the birth of Jesus in Rome. Matthew was writing 10 to 15 years after that in Turkey, okay? The Gospel of John comes to us 50 years after the death of Jesus from probably Egypt, okay? So here, the stories, for example, these infancy stories of Matthew and Luke, right? It would be as if the people in San Francisco, because look how far away these things are from one another. Rome's a hell of a long way from Egypt, right? In the first century, right? You have to do a lot of walking to get there, right? Turkey, Rome, right? And so you have, it would be as if Mark was in San Francisco and he wrote the stories that were circulating in the oral tradition. Are you with me? He was writing in San Francisco. Matthew, who wrote his gospel at least 10 years after that, he was writing in Portland, Oregon, right? And he didn't know about these stories. Matthew didn't know about these stories, okay? Luke didn't know about these stories. They had their own tradition that was going on, and they were writing those stories down. There were collections, okay? Now, is it clear so far? Is this clear so far what I'm saying, right? Yeah. Now, this is the documentary hypothesis, but I want to get this clear. Different communities told different stories about Jesus, right? For different reasons, okay? So this was not just one connected narrative. These are a number of different stories, right? Now, this idea that I was talking about, this documentary hypothesis, is very fascinating because it goes like this, right? The first gospel written was Mark, okay? Now, we believe that then both Matthew and Luke when they went to write their stories later, right? Since this was the first text that was written, okay, that Matthew and Luke both shared that text, actually had the Gospel of Mark in front of them, okay, when they wrote their Gospels, right? Now, there are other stories that Matthew and Luke have in common with one another, okay? So almost all of Mark is in both of these Matthew and Luke, but there are other stories that Matthew and Luke have in common with one another. Now, why would that be? They're writing at different times in different communities, right? Well, they think the reason why that is that one of the reasons is that there were these little collections of sayings and things about Jesus, all right? Saying source, because if you look at what Matthew and Luke have in common with one another, apart from the Gospel of Mark, they're sayings about Jesus. Are you with me? Okay, so quella in means saying, right? So, and this was German that developed this, right? And so there was this saying source, okay? And because saying in German is quella, they call it a Q source, right? So the stories that Matthew and Luke have in common with one another, apart from the stories of Mark, are these sayings of Jesus, okay? Now, and that's why these things are called synoptic gospels, because you can compare them, okay? And when you compare them, you start to see, oh, Matthew and Luke agree, have the same content that Mark has. This is where they have agreements. Then they tell then also what they have in common with one another is that they have these sayings of Jesus, right? But there's a whole other section, and this is what we're going to see when you look at the gospel narrative. I mean these birth narratives, right? Of Jesus. You see that there are stories that's original to Matthew, and there's also stories that's original to Mark, to Luke. Are you with me? All right? Now, what we're going to find out what you find out is when you look at these gospel, these birth narratives, is that same story at all, are they? They're telling different stories, okay? So these are the writings of Matthew that he doesn't share in common with Luke, even though they're talking about the birth of Jesus, okay? Clear? Now, that we have, well, here, let's see, what should I say? So, as I said, these texts themselves come out of an oral tradition, okay? Stories about Jesus. Stories and sayings passed on largely as self-contained units, okay? Now, there were also written collections of miracle stories and parables and sayings, right? Now, this is all in the oral tradition still, right? And that there were also what was called proto-gospels, these little bitty, like, novelettes about the life of Jesus, right? So all of this stuff was coming out of the oral tradition, and the gospel writers then would take these stories, right? And they would make a literary creation. They would make their own stories. Okay, and that's what a gospel is. It's a literary work of art. And when you start to examine these literary works of art, then you start to see that they have structures. Just like a novel has a structure, a gospel has a structure. And you can examine that gospel in terms of all sorts of structures that the gospel writer uses to spin their narratives. Okay? Now, we also know that, you know, these Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the canonical Gospels, we call them, right? They weren't the only Gospels that were written. Okay, there were many other Gospels that were written coming out of these early Greek Christian communities. Okay, and these are like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Mary. They have their own infancy Gospels in these things. All right. So these four Gospels that we know about are not the only Gospels in town. Okay, there were many different interpretations of the Christ event. Okay, you know, the oldest Gospel text that we know about is a fragment of John dating from the first half of the 2nd century. So imagine this, right? That the most ancient fragment that we have of any of these writings comes from that last Gospel of John, right? And that was like 150 years after the birth of Jesus. Isn't that fascinating? Okay, so let me stop there and see if there are any questions. Are there any questions from the Zoom audience? Is this interesting or is it boring? Is boringly interesting? Oh, okay.
So I assume the origin of all the stories came from first person people who knew Jesus telling the stories.
No.
Didn't the disciples all tell the stories?
Well, we don't. Well, this was. For years, people thought that these gospel writers were followers of Jesus, were the disciples of Jesus, right? Because in order to spin a literal interpretation of the text, what do you have to have? An eyewitness, all right? So if I just matter-of-factly say, oh, well, the meaning of these stories is that they're factually true, right? Then I have to spin another tale. Well, how can that be factually true? Oh, well, because these guys were all with Jesus and wrote it down. Boom, 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 boom. Right? This is what Jesus said, this is what this, right? Now, that particular belief about these texts that they were written by Jesus's disciples, this is part of this a literal interpretation of the gospel, right? Now, when you put that aside for a minute and you start to look at these texts to try to make sense of them critically, right? Critically, literary, when you start to look at their literary structures and their historical context, what you find is that we don't know who these people were. Some people believe that, like the Gospel of John, for example, that was written by the disciple whom Jesus loved, you know, in the Gospel of John, the disciple whom Jesus loved. Other people believe that it was Lazarus that actually wrote the text, right? But that was a legend, but there's absolutely no empirical evidence that that was the case, right?
Well, what I'm saying is that the original disciples of Jesus told these stories orally.
Yeah, right. Yeah, well,
but they weren't put into writing until these guys did.
Well, I mean, and it wasn't just the disciples of Jesus that told these stories orally. It was a whole early Christian community that told these stories orally, right? Yeah. So it's that's true that in the oral tradition, these stories originated. That is one of the places where it originated, probably from people hearing the teaching of Jesus, right? But there were all sorts of stories then that came about of the life of Jesus, right? I mean, look at those gospel look at those Gnostic texts, right? See, that's coming out of a Gnostic community that told stories about Jesus too, right? Just like Mark's story about Jesus is quite different than Luke's story about Jesus, right? In Matthew and Luke, Jesus becomes divine at birth. Well, Mark is telling an entirely different story. Jesus becomes divine at his baptism. And in John, then, that's a story about Jesus, but it's coming out of a different cultural context, right? Mm-hmm. So it wasn't that, well, the origin that these oral stories about Jesus were simply people that, you know, and the followers of Jesus had to rely on their memories as well, right? And so there were many different sources. And part of what we call the historical critical method is looking at these things, like source criticism, it's called, right? Where did these stories come from in the oral tradition? What kind of stories were they, right? What kinds of structures did they have, right? And then there's also redaction criticism, that means to edit, right? How were these stories edited together, okay? So if you look at the stories that these guys have in common with one another, they have many stories in common with one another, but they tell it in a different way, okay? Here? Is that better, right? So they may share a story, but they tell the story in a different place, or they tell it in a different way. Why is that? Well, because the theology of Mark, all right, is quite different than the theology of Matthew. It's quite different than the theology of Luke. And it certainly is different than the theology of John. They had different understandings of the Christ event, all right? And part of it was simply, these were different cultures. These were different cultures. Okay, tell me when, Matt.
Tilt the screen downward a little bit.
I can't. That's good. All right. Okay, any other questions here? Are there any questions from the audience, the Zoom audience? No questions. Uh-oh, that's, you know, when people don't have questions, that's never, ever a good sign. All right. Well, I tell you what, let's take a little break here, and then we'll come back. Okay, what time is it, Deb?
Let's just keep going.
Well, I have to take a break. That's what I'm saying. Let's just take like a little 5-minute break, and then we'll come back. Okay. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh, you can put your questions. You guys on Zoom, you can put your questions in the chat box. Okay, so let's just take a little break here, and then we'll come right back.
Thanks for coming. Thank you for listening. Thank you. I'm sorry I have to leave the room.
Thank you, Adrian.
Thank you, man. So did they come out yet with Michigan? Is it right? Are they playing today? No, they played yesterday. Playing again until December 31st, I don't think.
Hi there. Oh, yeah, I'm at a seminar. Yes, I can. I'll pick it up at 1. I'll have to leave here in about 15 minutes. Then. Okay. All right. Okay. Love you. Bye. I have to go pick up Grace.
Where's she at?
She's at a friend's in Eureka. Let's see. They're playing in the Orange Bowl against Georgia.
Oh my God.
So they did exactly what they thought they
So
did.
Jordan's down a few.
Rather
now.
than moving Michigan to.
How much time do we have? What is it?
It's almost 12:30.
When did I start?
Quarter till.
All right, friends, well, let's reassemble here. And we'll give it one more last shot here. So there are no questions, so we'll forge ahead here. I just wanted to say one more thing about John Shelby Spong's book. And that is, what's so fascinating about this book to me is that he points out that the early Christian community, let me preface this by saying that, well, if these aren't eyewitness accounts, if the gospel accounts aren't eyewitness accounts, what are they? All right, well, we said they're literary works, they're theological works, all right? But in this wonderful book, Biblical Literalism, Gentile Heresy, all right? He makes a fascinating point. He says, you have to remember that the early disciples of Jesus, the early followers of Jesus, where did they worship?
The temple.
They worshiped at the temple, and then when the temple was destroyed in the 70s, where did they worship?
In the little synagogue.
Well, they worshiped where Jesus worshiped, right? They worshiped in the synagogue, in the synagogues, all throughout the diaspora area, right? So the early Christians were Jews and worshiped, all right? And even though they were Christians, they still worshiped in the synagogue up until the time of like the writing of John. All right, so even after the temple was destroyed in the 70s, for 25 years, the Christians were still welcomed in the synagogue because they were Jews, okay? And this is what's so fascinating about this book, because Spong says, given that fact, he said, these stories about Jesus, the structures of the Gospels, the very structures of the Gospels, are structured in accordance with the Jewish liturgical year, okay? So what are we celebrating now? What's the Jewish community celebrating? Hanukkah, right? And what are we celebrating now?
Christmas,
What?
Christmas. Christmas.
Christmas. Advent, the Christmas season, right? Now let's think of it. So in other words, this is a great example, because when in the synagogue, when the Jewish community were telling the stories about Hanukkah, the early Christians started to tell stories about Jesus that corresponded to the themes of these
Jewish celebration.
liturgical celebrations of the Jews. Is that clear, right?
Except for the ones that Paul was doing.
Yeah, well, he's talking about the early Jewish.
Right.
Yeah, and so that's what this book is about. He goes through the Gospels. It's very fascinating. He goes through each Gospel and he shows that the very structure of the Gospel itself is paralleling the Jewish liturgical year, the readings and the themes of the Jewish liturgical year, right? So part of what accounts for the structures of the Gospel stories themselves is not simply that they were eyewitness accounts of first this happened, then happened, and narrative accounts, right? But their very structures mirrors that they were stories. The Gospels, the structures of the Gospels were stories that were told by the early Christian community in the synagogue when the Jewish community was telling their liturgical stories. Okay? And of course, what are these liturgical events, right? Well, they're the solstices and the equinoxes, right? The solstices and the equinoxes, right? This Christmas is a celebration of what? Winter solstice. Easter is a celebration of Passover for the Jews.
Spring equinox.
And spring equinox, at which time the Jews celebrate Passover. You have to use if you want to talk, you have to use Passover, right? And so do you see, right? Do you see? This is clear, well, that makes perfect sense. Makes perfect sense, right? And so I really encourage you, if you're at all interested in the Gospels and the meaning of these texts, to check out this wonderful book by Spong. I wanted to get into the first Christmas a little bit, but just let me say in passing that I really encourage you to get this book and to read this book, okay? And I just want to, we're going to talk about the first 3 chapters or the first section of the book now a little bit, and then we're going to talk for next time. I'm not going to be here next time. Deb's going to lead us in part 2, genealogy, conception, and birth, and then we'll come back for light, fulfillment, and joy. So the book's in 3 parts to a day. Part 1, parable, overture, and context. Next week, part 2, and then for the following week, of course, part 3, right? So in the section that we have for today, section 1, he lays out the difference in the stories that Matthew and Luke tell. And you can read all that. It's very, very fascinating, right? Very fascinating. The similarities between the stories and especially the differences between the stories, right? Then he makes the claim. He says, if you look at these stories and you see their similarities, you see their differences, he says, we've come to think of them as parables. These are parabolic stories, right? Parabolic stories. Jesus spoke in parables, right? When Jesus wanted to speak, Jesus spoke in parables. So he's saying that, like Jesus spoke in parables, these stories, infancy stories about Jesus in Matthew, Luke are also parables. And then this is what he says. He says, to state our interpretive decisions, we best understand the nativity stories and their meanings by treating them as neither fact nor fable, but parable. Parable is a form of speech, just as poetry is a form of speech. It's a way of using language. He says, the meaning of a parable, its parabolic truth, does not depend upon its factuality, all right? If you look at the parables that Jesus tells, what's a parable that Jesus tells?
One of the parables?
Yeah, what are the parables?
Prodigal son.
The prodigal son, beautiful example, right? Here's a story about a prodigal son, right? Now, did anybody in their right mind ever read that parable and think to themselves, oh, well, you know, the meaning of this parable is that once upon a time, there was this guy who lived here with his father and ran away and squandered his wealth and came back, right? No, we don't think that way about parables. Why? Because we understand they're a parable. And what is the meaning of a parable, right? Its meaning does not lie in factuality, all right? It's a metaphor. And religion and religious propositions, the writings of scriptures, use symbol and parable and metaphor to express meaning. And the fact that they may not be factual does not mean that they aren't meaningful, unless the only way that you think about meaning is a fact. Are you with me? So once you loosen up a little bit, then this stuff becomes really fascinating. So then they also say that refer to these infancy narratives as parables, right? And they say parabolic, and they're also overtures. They're overtures. So in the first two chapters of the Gospel of Matthew, the first two chapters of the Gospel of Luke, you have parables. Like Jesus told parables to make his point, Matthew and Luke are telling parables to make their point about Jesus, okay? Now, it's not the same point that they're making. For example, in the Gospel of Mark, it's clear that one of the things that Mark wants to say about Jesus, the way that Matthew understood Jesus, and Matthew's community understood Jesus, right? Was Jesus came to what? Fulfill the law, not to destroy the law, but to fulfill the law. He was a lawgiver, like who? Like Moses, right? And so when Matthew tells his gospel stories time and time again, right? He makes these parallels between the life of Jesus, the life of Moses, right? Because he wants to assure the Jewish community that, no, we Christians may differ from you, right? But we are also here to fulfill the law, all right? Christianity is part of the evolution of the religious consciousness of the Jewish people. This is what's being said in Matthew. Now, you can agree with that or disagree with that, but this is what's clearly being said, right? And the stories then, the parables that Matthew tells in his first couple of chapters about the infancy of Jesus, then has to do with making this fact. Because where does Jesus end up in the Gospel of Matthew with his family? Down in Egypt, like Deb was talking about this morning in her sermon, right? So it starts right there, you see? And this is what they mean when they say not only are these parables, but they're also overtures. Now, what's an overture like in a piece of music? Well, that's at the beginning, right? A beginning that starts out, and it often contains these leitmotifs that just keep coming back and back and back in the piece, right? Bach does this all of the time, all of the time, right? Leitmotifs, da-da-dum, ba-ba-bum, ba-ba-bum, bum, ba-ba-bum, 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 bum, right? And that just keeps coming back and back and back again. So the overture begins the process. So the overture is like a little mini picture of the entire novel, right? And so these parables about these parables in the first two chapters of Matthew and Luke are the overtures to the whole rest of the gospel. So they're mirroring the meaning or the theological interpretation that's going to be given all throughout the text, right? And I think that's a brilliant way to think about it, right? Just like Jesus told parables to make his point, right? To get the meaning clear across to people, Jesus told parables. So the Gospels themselves are reflective of that exact process, okay? So I don't go, so the reason why the infancy stories in Matthew differ from the infancy stories in Luke, right, is because they're different parables. They're different meanings, they're different interpretations. And like I said, these interpretations come out of different contexts. These people wrote at different times. These people wrote in different cultures, okay? The life situation of Matthew's community was not the life situations of Mark's community, was not the life situation of Luke's community, right? And I think that's a very, that's very eye-opening, because then you look at these stories and instead of transgressing against the text in the sense of you run all of it together as if it's one historical connected narrative, right? Which makes no sense whatsoever. You're either born in Bethlehem or Nazareth, right? You can't be born in both places. There's all these discrepancies because they're different stories. And we run them all together as if they're one connected historical narrative. You see, you destroy the very meaning of the text when you do that. And we do the same thing, it's really clear, we do the same thing to the beginning of Scripture. When we look, there's two creation counts in Genesis, Genesis 1, Genesis 2. Those are two different creation counts. We read them together as if they're one story. Oh, but they aren't just one story, right? They're two different stories coming from two different tribes of Israel, right? Miles apart from one another, right? And at hundreds of years, writing in different times, right? So different. Here's a tribe that's told by the Lakota people 500 years ago, a story, right? A creation story. Here's another creation story told by the Crow people, right? And they have their creation story, and the Lakota people have their creation story. They're different cultures. There's some similarity, but they're different cultures. They tell different stories. They use different language, right? And then here, we put the stories together as if it's a connected narrative, right? And one of the reasons we can do that, if you read the story in the original Hebrew, you would see, that would help you see, right? That the word for God in the first chapter of Genesis is quite different than the word for God in the second chapter of Genesis, right?
Elohim in the first chapter.
Elohim in the first chapter,
Yahweh.
and Yahweh in the second. Those stories were, the one story is hundreds and hundreds of years older than the other story. And they came from, one from the southern tribes, one from the northern tribes, right? And now we don't realize that because we've lost the context, the original context of the story. And then we take Genesis 1 and we read, that's what, okay. And then Genesis 2, it's like, now wait a minute. The earth's already been created, and then in like Genesis 2, the 4th verse, like there's another creation story. But we just kind of like, well, that must just be all one creation story, you see? And we do exactly the same thing with these texts from Matthew and Luke, like I've spoken about before, right? So I hope, is it clear what I'm saying here, right? So I believe, and I am convinced that, this is a very meaningful way to look at these stories, and a very truthful way to get at the meaning of these stories, right? Just like Jesus told parables that had meanings, the early church, the early Christian people told parables about Jesus that had meaning, right? And let me end here by giving a wonderful, I love this quote from Dominic Crossan. He says, my point, once again, is not that those ancient people told literal stories and we are now smart enough to take them symbolically. Okay? But that they told them symbolically and now we're dumb enough to take them literally. And there's something to be said for this. Let me read that again. My point, once again, is not that those ancient people told literal stories and we are now smart enough to take them symbolically, but that they told them symbolically and we are now dumb enough to take them literally. So in other words, they told them as parables. Okay? What is the meaning of the Christ event? What is the meaning of Christmas? If you reduce the meaning of Christmas to something that happened 2,000 years ago, right? Then to be a Christian in this, what does it mean to be a Christian now? Well, it means you just have to intellectually believe that that was a fact, okay? And if you intellectually believe that that was a fact that happened 2,000 years ago, right? Then you don't have to trouble yourself with symbol, image, metaphor, or parable, right? And then the people who is in your in-group of Christians, you have to believe the same way about that. You see, it's a way to divide and to confuse people. It's always been a way to divide and to confuse people. It used to be that we thought in the early church, everybody thought alike. Everybody shared these gospels. And they were all eyewitness accounts and everything was cool and everybody believed the same thing. Baloney. Because in the last, 50, 75 years, what have we found? Well, we found these texts, these canonical texts, were only 4 of these vast gospels that was written in the entire diaspora, the entire Middle East, from different communities who were also Christian communities, right? There were Jewish Christian communities originally, right? But immediately, Paul was writing already for the Gentile communities, right? So even before the Gospel of Mark was written, this was a big deal in the church, right? Because what was happening here? Because Judaism had already made inroads into the Greek-speaking world, right? Because the Greeks were all around there, like the Romans, right? Jesus grew up in a hill country of Galilee where he could see a Greek city. You with me? See a Greek city. And so one of the interesting dynamics is that the stories about Jesus that originated in the synagogue, okay, originated in the synagogue with the Jewish Christians structuring the stories about Jesus in accordance with the Jewish liturgical year, right? So that was the meaning of these stories, the context of the meaning, part of the context of the meaning of those stories, right? What happens is that 150 years later, that Jewish context is entirely lost, okay? And what do you have? You have Greek culture, Greek Christians, all right? Are you with me? And these Greek Christians did not understand the original context of the meaning of the Jewish stories. So they took them literally, not as parables, Because when the early Jewish Christian community heard them, they would understand the parable. Why? What was being said, the meaning. Why? Because they knew the context. They knew the context. Okay? 150 years after Jesus, the Greek church didn't know the context. And so they took them literally. And that is why John Shelby Spong says biblical literalism is a Gentile heresy. Right? Not a Jewish heresy. If you want to understand the text, then you have to take the time to look at them in their context of meaning. If you don't do that, and once that meaning is lost, it's lost. And then what do you do except take these things seriously? You know, Robert Graves wrote this wonderful book. Pardon me?
Except take them literally.
Take them literally, yeah.
Seriously.
Yeah, and he's saying that's what the early Gentile church did. They took the stories literally because they didn't know the context of their meaning. That's all they had. Right? And it's very fascinating. In this wonderful book, The White Goddess, by Robert Graves, he makes this point about the Greeks. He has this little section out of Plato, right? This dialogue, right? And one of Plato's disciples is walking around and they come across this beautiful sea and it's the cliffs. And one of Plato's disciples asks him, he says, "Oh, is it here that this event took place in ancient times?" This mythical event took place in ancient times, right? And Plato says, "No, I don't think it was here, but it was farther down the coast a little bit," right? But he says, "As for me," he says, I don't put any stock in these stories and this stuff," right? That's fine, but I really don't care about this. To which Robert Graves says something very interesting, and I think very true. He said, already by the time of Plato, the Greeks had lost the context and hence the meaning of their own religious stories. Do you see what I'm saying? That's how religion evolves. Sooner or later, you're going to lose the context of your story. When I get old, I start to lose the context of my story. We all do. Our societies do. Our cultures do. It used to be that people knew the stories about the Greek gods. Then it used to be not that long ago, right, that if you were an educated person, you knew about Greek mythology. Who the hell knows about Greek mythology now? Hardly anybody. Why is that? Because as the years progress, you get farther and farther and farther away from the meaning, the context, meaning context of the story, okay? And then the symbols and the images become reified. You literally believe they're true, and then the game is lost. And Graves gives this wonderful example of this, right? So remember, the idea is that already by the time of Plato, the Greeks have lost the context of the meaning of their religious stories. And then he gives this example. He gave the example from Plato, but then he gives another example. He says, you know, there was this image of the Cyclops, the story about the Cyclops, right? And the Cyclops were what? People that had a third eye here, right? A third eye, okay? And so when we read the story today, and when the Greeks at the time of even Jesus read the story, they thought the meaning of that story was that the people that wrote it, right, hundreds of years ago, they literally believed that there were these beings that had a third eye, though. Are you with me? That was the Cyclops. You know what Robert Graves said? He said, you know who the Cyclops, who they really were, what that was about? He said they were a guild of blacksmiths. A guild of blacksmiths, right? And they branded themselves with one of the instruments that they used all the time in their work to identify themselves as members of the guild. It had nothing to do about some zoological improbability. Are you with me? And I'm saying that same dynamic is what's going on here. And that's the beauty of Spong's writing. That's the beauty of Borg and Crossan. All right? You lose the context of the story, you lose the meaning of the story, and you're reduced to a literal belief in absolute and total foolishness. So, let me share with you one final thought of Crossan, and then we'll end there. Jesus told parables. When he wanted to say something really profound about God, he went into parable. I don't find it surprising then that when earliest Christianity wanted to say something profound about Jesus, they went into parable too. That doesn't mean everything is a parable. When it says Jesus was in Nazareth, I don't think that is a parable. I think Jesus was in Nazareth. When it talks about Jesus walking on the water, I don't think that's the point at all. I think that point is that the church without Jesus sinks. Okay? Now, I would say part of what it means to be a responsible modern Christian is to be able to make those distinctions, to realize when the story is metaphorical and when the story is factual. Okay, so I hope that you found these reflections meaningful, and we'll take time now if there are any questions. But this was sort of like a prolegomena to what I see as to the basic points of these texts. So let's see if there are any questions.
You can join us on Zoom next week. You can join us on Zoom next week and participate in the discussion.
Yeah. Let's see if there are any questions.
I have other things that I have heard or know. For instance, there were 2 Bethlehems. There was one just south of Galilee, and then there was the one in Judea. And so there's a theory going around that this other Bethlehem is where they actually went to, where Jesus was born.
Right. Oh, yeah. I mean, there are a million interpretations, right, of these stories, right?
But it reminds me of finding skeletons of elephants, because elephants, where their trunks are, have a third eye. And they thought they were Cyclops skeletons. I mean, that's how things get twisted around.
Are there any questions coming up? Hey, Jared.
No, just that very thought-provoking, very fascinating.
Oh, well, good. For next time, I have to go down to southern Indiana. My cousin that was like a sister to me is not doing well. I have to go see her this week. So, so what we discussed today was a little bit about part 1, parables as overtures, okay? So if you haven't read that, read that, okay? And then for next time, we'll go over genealogy, conception, and birth, part 2. Genealogy is destiny, an angel comes to Mary in David's city of Bethlehem. Any more questions? Let me just say that I think Spong was right about fundamentalism. Okay. I think it's a tremendous evil, religious evil, and that right now, you know, you have about 80% of religious fundamentalists who are bordering on political fascism, and that goes hand in hand. Political fascism and religious fascism goes hand in hand. That there's a relationship between the way in which you think about God and your politics, okay? But having said that, I think we as Christians have the freedom to think how we want to think. There is no one way, there's never been one way to think about the faith. There's never been one way to be Christian. There's never been one way to interpret these texts, right? Now, I totally believe that fundamentalism is an evil, okay? But having said that, some of the most loving people that I've known have been fundamentalists, okay? I take fundamentalism to be an ignorance, okay? And that doesn't mean that that's necessarily a moral criticism, an ultimate moral criticism, right? But in my life, what I have experienced is that it's not been those people who understand the truth of Scripture in the way that Borg and Crossan and Spong understand it, right? That these are parabolic truths, all right? That you don't have to literally interpret these things, that the meaning of these stories is not that it's not a factual meaning, it's a metaphoric meaning, okay? But it's been my experience that people that think like that, that have that freedom to think like that, are far less likely to morally condemn people who disagree with them, okay? It's been my experience in the church, having been raised in a Germanic Lutheran fundamentalism, right? That it's those Christians who are fundamentalists who want to exclude other people because they don't think like they do. They don't interpret the text like they do, okay? That's been my experience. And say maybe your experience has been different, and that's great, all right? But I want to be clear about that. To me, there's a different, you know, I was very lucky in life. I came from very uneducated people. You know, we could hardly speak, my grandparents could hardly read and write. I don't blame them for being religious fundamentalists, right? But I blame them for blaming other people that weren't, okay? So anyway, thank you all, and I hope that I always enjoy talking about these things. And next week, either I'm going to be joining you on Zoom from Southern Indiana, or Deb's going to be leading a class or something. But anyway, let's meet here again around 11:30. Do you have anything? Anybody have anything to say? No? Okay. All right. Thank you, friends. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you so much.
So next week, are we gonna be able to like get people on Zoom?
So we could, we have that.
Yeah,